Last week we dried and smoked bison meat. This week, the simplest bison soup. Just like last week, the ideas for this episode actually come from the journal of Nicholas Creswell, 1774 to 1777. And here's a little bit from his journal. Kentucky River, Saturday, June 10th, 1775. The people at the camp we lodged at last night gave us some smoked meat. On inspecting our flour, we found it does not amount to a whole to more than 15 pounds amongst 5 people. Must have no more bread, but save our flour for soup. So this week we're going to be using some of that same smoked and dried bison meat that we actually smoked up last week, and it tasted so good. It's so wonderful for something that you can just put in your mouth and eat right away, but sometimes you want a real meal. And so we're going to take just a little bit of flour, just like Nicholas Creswell had, just a little bit of flour that they decided that they would no longer go ahead and make the little bread cakes right there on the fire like they were before. That was a waste of the flour. They were going to spread it out and they were going to use it in soup. So we're going to take a little bit of our bison here and a little bit of flour and make some soup. I want to give this bison time to kind of steep and expand a little bit in my nice hot water. And instead of just throwing in these whole strips, I'm going to cut these down into nice edible little pieces. So let's cut this up. So I'm cutting this at a diagonal. I want this to definitely break apart as much as possible to make it a lot easier to eat and for that water to get all the way in there and make it into a nice soup. We're gonna let this meat sit in there and stew a while. We want that flavor to get all the way out and into our soup. While that's cooking, let's talk about flour. Flour was a ration, one of the provisions that they brought along with them on this journey, and it was of a great concern about what happens to this ration. They didn't bring enough, and some of that gets damaged along the way. He writes in May 25th, 1775, on inspection, we find our flour much damaged. We're obliged to come to an allowance of a pint a man per day. Had we come to this resolution sooner, it would have been better. Great quarreling among the company, and then later on the next day he writes, our company still continues to be crabbed with one another, and then I believe it will grow worse as the bread grows scarce. And of course he does find that to be true. The whole group of people, they get very upset with one another. There are quarrels, they have fights, and they break apart at different times. And the ration continues to grow scarcer and scarcer. And then, of course, I read the earlier piece, which comes later on in the book, where he says that they have to stop making that bread by the fire, and they have to start using it just in their soup to make that ration spread out even farther. Our bison has stewed up here for quite a while. Longer is probably better in this kind of situation. It really takes quite a while for that boiling water to break down the meat and get it to be soft. This one's cooked up about 45 minutes, or maybe it's been an hour or so, I'm not really sure. But it's starting to definitely soften up a little bit, and depends on how long you want to take this to cook. I'm going to go ahead and let this cook for quite a while. But now I can go ahead and add a little bit of my flour into this. I'm only just going to use a little bit of flour here just to thicken this up, because obviously I've got a very small ration here and it has to last a long time. So I'm going to put this in and stir it up so that it doesn't kind of turn into little dumplings. It'll try to do that anyway, and that's all right. But if it boils for a little while, it'll break up and get a little bit smoother. And even Nicholas Creswell, he did have at times something just a little bit more flavorful. He talks about when they're drying the beef, if you've got salt with you, it makes it much more flavorful. And I just have this tiny little supply of mushroom powder, which is a lot like salt, but a lot more flavorful. And I'm just gonna put in just a smidgen of this mushroom powder. He really talks about that people get really bored with the same thing over and over again, and it doesn't take much to make something really special when you're on the trail. Well, there's our soup. It's thickened up nicely. It's made of just water and the bison dried up and just a little bit of flour and of course the tiniest bit of flavoring. Let's see how it tastes. That is extraordinarily good for as simple as this is. We get this wonderful smoked, bison flavor in there. That hint of mushroom powder. If you make mushroom ketchup, make sure to save the mushroom powder. It's one of the best parts. Very concentrated, wonderful flavors. So if you haven't seen the episode where we dried this bison meat over the fire, make sure to look that one up. Such a wonderful episode. And it's really so very, very interesting to look back into these journals, read about them, and then to actually live this out. Right? Dry that bison meat exactly the way they dried it, and then eat these rations the same way they did. Really, you learn so much by actually doing history, living it out. Such wonderful tastes, flavors right out of history. It's so much fun. This American Frontier series has really been a great series to work on. We've got more episodes coming up with Dan Wowak and episodes in the future, so make sure to stay tuned. I want to thank you for coming along today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century.